Hello, everybody. This is Randy Nordby. I want to welcome you to a really interesting case study that we're going to cover in private wealth today and risk management. So what's interesting about this case that we're going to review today, first of all, it's going to be very, very long and it's very, very detailed. But what we're going to do is we're going to follow a family all the way through when they graduate college, all the way until they retire, and all the different challenges that are going to happen and different allocations and different ways to think. And we're going to be dealing with children and special needs children and all sorts of things. So I really love this case study in risk management that we're going to cover on private wealth. But I do want to caution you, I'm going to be presenting a lot of data, a lot of information, much more so than you're likely to face on the exam in a particular case. But what I want you to focus on are what are the issues as I'm going through and explaining this and setting this up. What is it that you're gaining from this? What are you pulling out from this data? And again, with any type of IPS, I want you to go through the process. Again, you need a repeatable, scalable process. This is a repeatable, scalable process that needs to be done here. So again, I want you to get in the habit of writing TTLLURR. And remember, for the first R, risk, there's ability to bear risk and willingness to bear risk. Okay? So because this is private wealth, we need to consider both. If this were institutions, we wouldn't focus on willingness to bear risk. So willingness to bear risk is going to bring in the emotional side, really link in the behavioral finance side. And remember, ability to bear risk is primarily contingent on the time horizon and liquidity needs. And what's so great about this particular case is we're going to go through each of the different stages of someone's life. So you can look at situational profiling, and I always want you to keep this idea of time horizon, liquidity. What do I need in order to fund? Now, it's not as specific as asset liability management where we're literally just focusing on that liability. We're still using mean variance optimization, and we're still ultimately trying to reach that goal, that challenge. Now, there might be significant conflicting challenges here. Okay, so we're not focusing on asset liability management directly, but we're still thinking about this. Okay, so going forward, I'd like you to keep that in mind. So again, TTLLURR, and remember, the first R is risk, so you're going to have ability to bear risk and willingness to bear risk. Okay, and the other thing, we're not going to have time to really test you on this material in this lecture. So you need to pull out the quizzes that we prepared in the Kaplan material and take a look at the CFA source material. You need to test yourself. You need to quiz yourself and make sure you're getting the points that you need to make. One of the biggest things that I hear from level 3 candidates, they have trouble deciphering, hey, there's all this information, what's important? So you need to focus on what material information is being presented that impacts my ability to build a portfolio. Okay, so think about that as we go through. And again, we're not using asset liability management. So we're still using mean variance optimization, but the other thing that we're going to start thinking about again is what if there are conflicting goals that this family has, and in fact they will have. So we're going to use a goals-based method. So there are going to be numerous portfolios instead of one. Now again, they most likely will not be fully, as an overall perspective, fully optimized, from mean variance optimization. but each of the portfolios will use mean variance optimization. So again, they may be inefficient as a whole, but individually, we're still doing the same process. Okay, so risk management, it's going to be a vital piece of putting together a personal financial plan. And as we've talked about this, we're going to go all through the life stages, so there are going to be different risks that are applied to different time periods. The other thing that I want to stress, we will be taking a holistic view of the client's circumstances, and we're going to be offering them tailored advice to their goals and needs. So I can't stress enough, suitability is going to be critical, and it's going to change as the client progresses during the different life stages. So for this reading, actually this whole reading that we do, we're going to be really gearing this towards what learning outcome statements, what are the LOSs that the CFA Institute is telling us that we need to focus on. So again, we're going to tweak this into helping you get out of the information what you need in order to master the topics that are important, likely to be tested. Okay, so the original reading provides numerous details. It goes into extensive detail on economic conditions, local regulations, tax laws, and so on. And these details, they help because they provide this holistic view. But again, it is very unlikely that you're going to get pages and pages and pages of background information. Instead, the exam questions are likely going to provide a narrower list of things, and those are the things that you're going to spend your time and those precious minutes in the morning on. Okay, so this reading is going to focus on identifying families' risk exposure throughout their different stages of their lives. I've never seen a case like this from the CFA Institute before. You know, we always get one stage and they go in. Now we're going to be following these same people all through the different life stages. So there's a lot of things to learn here. So we're going to talk about what type of risks that they face in their early career, their career development, their peak accumulation, and then an early retirement. And as I mentioned, each stage is going to come with new variables and new challenges. So we as professionals are going to have to find ways to help mitigate or maybe even remove any of these risks that the family might face. I almost feel like we should hear Star Wars theme or music. I mean, this is the big challenge. Dun, da, da, da. Okay, so just trying to make sure you're awake. Okay, so again, exam focus, what I want you to keep in mind. Each stage is just a snapshot in time with multiple variables. So I need you to keep focusing on the information that is being presented for this stage. And this is going to be the hardest thing that you're going to deal with. Right here. You've got to resist the temptation to use external variables, particularly your experience, to justify a risk management recommendation. You have to use the information that you were taught. And the difficult part is, as a CFA Level 3 candidate, you're probably not an entry person in the company anymore. You've moved up, so you've been taught how your firm does things and how the industry does things. Remember, there is a CFA world and there's a real world. And you need to revert back to what was I taught. So again, I cannot stress this enough. Stick to what you've been taught in the material and resist the temptation to show the newest method that you just read about in the Financial Analyst Journal. Okay, so let's start at the first stage. We're at the early career stage. So Jessica and Paul Schmidt, how old are they? They're both age 28. They've been recently married. They're in the early phase of their careers. Both Jessica and Paul graduated with master's degrees 3 years ago, Jessica in computer science and Paul in mathematics. Now, Paul is taking a teaching position at a local school. He earns a gross salary of €45, and it translates to, after taxes, about $33,670. Okay, so that's important to know. Now, Jessica, on the other hand, she went a different route. She joined an IT startup. So her gross annual salary is $24,000, but after taxes, her salary is actually lower at €20,490. And the Institute gives us a little bit more information about Jessica's thought process. So even though her salary is low, she expects to receive bonuses if the startup becomes successful, and these bonuses could become a significant share of her compensation. So she believes the startup will succeed, and she prefers the potential upside in this opportunity rather than go out to look to higher paying positions. Okay, so the couple have combined savings of €15,000. And aside from their participation in the government's pension plan, they have almost no other financial assets. And remember, when you start in the early career stage, what happens? Your human capital is very high. Your financial capital tends to be very low. So as you continue to work and gain more skills, that human capital gets converted into financial capital, where when you're at retirement, your human capital is almost zero, but you should have a lot of financial capital. Okay, so their only other asset outside of this $15,000 to note is their car. And they do have automobile insurance, so that protects them from liabilities for other people's repair cost or injury compensation. Now, the Smiths are debt-free because their parents covered their expenses while they're in college, and tuition costs were relatively low. Like many of you, you might be thinking, wow, maybe I wanted to be in that family. Many of you have a lot of student loan debt. It's actually pretty typical out there. So again, in this example, they don't have to worry about the onerous student loan debt. Now, the Schmidt's monthly expenses are $2,900 and a rent of €1,000. I don't know where they live. In Washington, D.C., you can't even get a parking spot for $1,000 a month. Okay, so let's take a look at the Schmidt's finances. So what do we see? We see net income. That's where I would be focusing on. So they've got $54,160 combined. What's their source of income? Paul is a teacher. Jessica is in an IT startup. Their annual living expenses are $34,000. Their financial assets are $15,000. They have no debt, and they have a car that's worth about $7,000. Okay, so their objectives, and remember, when you're dealing in the institutional world, oftentimes the objectives are more straightforward and they're a little bit easier to deal with. Now we have a number of objectives. I want to ensure long-term financial security. I want to ensure a comfortable retirement. They want to start a family, and they want to purchase a condo. Well, I wanted to play basketball for the Lakers. Apparently, being 5'6" and overweight and not being able to run or jump very well, that made that not possible. So what part of your job as a wealth professional is to analyze, are all of these objectives reasonable? And again, we're going to get into this in a little while, but you need to focus on which ones are more priority over others, okay? Now, recently they toured a home for €270,000, and the neighborhood has seen a lot of appreciation. So they did some research and they found that they can get a 25-year mortgage. The rate would be 3.6 per year. That's fixed for 5 years, and then it becomes floating after that. Now, what have we done so far? We've just identified their financial objectives, and we've discussed their financial assets and liabilities. And I want to just stop here for a second and again, just make sure that everybody is with me. So right now, the biggest asset on their holistic balance sheet is this human capital. They have computer science and mathematical skills. So their human capital is very high. Financial capital, they have 15,000 euro. So their financial capital is low. Now, as they progress, this financial capital should be monetized as they monetize this human capital. So the financial capital should go up as they get older. Okay, but right now it's low. So I want you to think about where the Institute is going now. And this is a very interesting way, and I think it's a useful way to understand the client's situation. So let's think about how their human capital differs. So let's do just a little attribution now on human capital. So Paul's human capital is very bond-like as he continues in his career as a teacher. He has high job security. What does that mean? Well, it's going to limit his earnings risk. We don't have to worry about him getting fired, immediately. Now, Paul's job may not be portable because if he comes to try to teach in America, he may have to go back to school and maybe get different rules and regulations in order to teach. Now, his income is expected to increase as he gains seniority, but he's also not going to be in the Forbes top 100 list. He's got limited upside potential. Now, let's look at Jessica. In contrast, her income is very equity-like. There are significant unknowns related to her future employment cash flows. If the IT firm does well, she's going to make some serious money. But if it doesn't, there's a high risk of unemployment, and there's just not significant job security here. Now, her discretionary bonus payments, they could be substantial or they could be zero. Okay? And her human capital is portable. It is very much a global world, and her skills are going to be transferable to pretty much any company. So when you think about it from a diversified standpoint of human capital, they actually have a strong diversification. Paul's job is more bond-like, Jessica's job is more equity-like, so they have a diversified human capital portfolio. Now we're going to turn to actually identifying and analyzing their risk exposures. This is something that I want to caution you on. There was nothing in the case that said Jessica or Paul had health issues. They didn't talk about any of them having heart murmurs or diabetes or a stroke or anything. So we can assume that they're young and in good health. But just because they're young and in good health, they're still going to face these risks. And that's why we do the situational profiling. Now, we still have to verify it, but they didn't tell us anything about their health. So I would like you to assume, unless they tell you otherwise, that these people are healthy. Remember, in these cases, primarily these are the luckiest people in the world. They don't have bad problems. Their parents pay all their debt. They don't have any student loans. Okay, so I want you to think about it. Even though they're young and in good health, it doesn't mean they don't have risks. So what risks do they face in the early career stage? Well, there's an earnings risk. Well, guess what? Either of them could be unemployed, and what people don't think about, disability. You can walk out to get the mailbox and slip. Crazy things happen. So even though both are young and have little in the way of financial capital, what is their largest asset on that economic balance sheet? It's the human capital. So we need to protect this. It's going to take time to convert that human capital to financial capital. So the two biggest drivers of earnings risk at this early career stage is going to be the risk of unemployment and the risk of a health event or disability. Okay, so we need to address both of those issues because both of these could derail these clients very, very quickly. Okay, another risk. So let's talk about unemployment, diving into a little bit. Who faces more risk? Jessica does. She faces a significant increased amount of risk compared to Paul. So now what is the chance of Jessica losing her job? We don't know. It doesn't really give us enough information, but it's higher than likely that she'll be unemployed before Paul is. Okay, they're also paying into a Social Security system for a few years, so they are entitled to some unemployment benefit, but it's doubtful it's going to replace all of their salaries. It might replace some, and in the future it might not replace any, depending on how it goes. So we need to dive into this area of disability because, again, we need to protect this human capital. So even though Jessica and Paul are young and fit, the risk of a health event or disability, unfortunately, it is still present. And yes, they would be entitled to disability payments from probably some state Social Security system. But monthly income from that source is likely not going to be a salary replacement. Okay, now there's also premature death risk. So the case doesn't talk about death. It doesn't talk about them being in bad health, so we assume they're in good health. But there's still a chance that one of them can die. If that happens, the surviving spouse at this early career stage is going to have a one-time cost, probably funeral expenses. They're going to need to establish an emergency fund and pay all living expenses on their own. So there is premature death risk here. Okay, what about car accidents and repair costs? Again, this is holistic. We're looking at everything. So they own an older car. They have insurance policy that protects them in case they cause injury to someone else. However, there's nothing in there that protects their car from maybe the engine breaking down or themselves having some problems with their car. Now, home purchase that they thought about. They don't have a lot of cash flow to support short-term expenditures. Remember, they had 15,000 euro. Now, most of the couple's assets, they are covered by insurance, and we didn't see any other major liability risks. So they could finance this home, but doing a substantial down payment is really going to put a squeeze on their financial capital, their actually assets, in order to handle emergencies. So as we go through and manage this family's risk exposure during the various stages, so in the early career stage, we talked about earnings risk. We identified two drivers of earnings risk: sudden unemployment and a health or disability event. How do we mitigate these? Well, the way we're going to deal with it is going to be different. So unemployment, earnings risk resulting from unemployment is very problematic and it's hard to insure against. Now, in some countries, you may get supplemental income for a while to aid you to finding another job. So I think this is the best method. One of the best ways to protect against sudden job loss is to accumulate a savings buffer. So the Institute recommends 6 months. I actually say that's not enough. I would like at least a year, and I think another way you can protect yourself against sudden job loss is to keep up in skills. Even as you get older, you need to keep learning, you need to keep educating yourself. That's probably the best way to keep yourself against sudden job loss. But absolutely, you're going to need an emergency fund, and the Institute recommends 6 months. So disability insurance. This can address that danger of human capital that we have exposed. So we want to purchase a policy that'll help us, and we also think our income is going to increase, So I want a policy that I can add to it and purchase additional coverage if I need to. Now, if we're going to figure out the amount of disability insurance needed, we can calculate the present value of their net earnings that need to be replaced. Okay, so net income to be replaced. Jessica, $20,490. Paul, $33,670. Annual disability coverage we see is $18,000. Shortfall, Jessica has $2,490. Paul has $15,670. We can look at a benefit period until they're going to retire, 37 years. We assume a 2% benefit adjustment, a 3% discount rate. So we can basically calculate the present value of future earnings replacement of basically what we need for an annuity due. For Jessica, we need $77,700, and for Paul, we need almost $500,000. Okay, so this idea of premature death risk, how can we protect ourselves against that? Both Jessica and Paul should take on life insurance to support the other's loss of future income. And just so you remember, there are two methods for calculating the amount of coverage. The first method is the human life value. We estimate the amount of future earnings that need to be replaced. There's also a needs analysis. I tend to lean more towards a needs analysis, especially when you have a spouse whose income could be all over the place. So the needs analysis estimates the amount needed to cover living expenses for the surviving spouse. So we're going to go ahead and use the needs analysis method because there's so much uncertainty about the level of future insurance, I wouldn't even know what needs to be replaced. Okay, so their total cash needs, funeral, emergency funds, debt, etc. $30,000 for Paul and Jessica. Capital needs, so this is the present value of the surviving spouse, $25,000 annual living expenses. So basically it's the present value of the survivor's income until they retire. Paul is $411,000. Jessica is actually negative at $77,000. Total financial needs, Paul needs $441,000. Jessica needs negative $47,000. We've got some savings we can invest, $15,000, less the present value of any vested retirement accounts. So additional life needs, Paul needs $414,000. Jessica actually needs a little less at $83,000. Okay, what about this idea of car accidents or repair costs? Hey, they have car insurance. That's going to cover other parties in an accident, but it doesn't cover their car. And because they rarely use their car, they should just simply choose to self-insure any things they have problems with their car with their savings buffer. Okay, liability risk, they have minimal liability risk. There's really nothing to recommend at this stage. Now, let's talk about this home purchase. So the couple has little financial capital. So we're going to advise them at this point, purchasing a home is not a good idea. So instead of purchasing a home, we're going to develop a savings plan and we're going to increase those financial assets. So if we purchased a home in the near future, it basically is going to leave them without any other financial assets, and we don't want to do that. Okay, so we need to create a substantial savings buffer of at least 6 months worth of expenses. Once that savings buffer is in place, then the couple should start drawing up an investment plan.